Location: suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri. Time: 6:07 a.m. Day 1. Chris Brown, 35, an Army veteran and K-9 police instructor, was finishing his morning training session with his beloved Belgian Shepherd named Ranger. Their duo was well known among the locals. The dog not only searched for explosives, but also understood more commands than some of the young cops. They were practicing this silent alert when the dog finds the target but does not bark. When Chris's cell phone beeped. A message from a colleague. Something's going on in the city. Attacks. Madmen. People are biting people. We've been told to stay at the station, not to go out. Chris shrugged. Panic again, like during those subway explosions. But Ranger, he was nervous. Strange. The dog didn't react to the sirens, but this morning he was clearly growling in the direction of the city. Chris turned on the TV. Breaking news. The anchor's voice trembled. Reports of extremely aggressive individuals attacking passersby. Authorities are urging people to stay home. At that moment, Chris heard sounds of a struggle outside the window. Screams, muffled blows. He ran outside. Two men were fighting in the street, but one of them was biting the other right in the neck. Ranger jumped up, growling. Chris rushed after him. Everything he knew about the world had just ceased to be true. Chris yanked Ranger's leash when he saw him lunge at the bloodied man, who was still tearing at his victim's neck. But the sheepdog, accustomed to clear commands, slowed down at the last moment. The dog growled low and menacingly, and it wasn't a simulation or training. Chris shouted, "Hey, get away from him." The bloodied figure slowly raised its head. Its eyes were dead white, its pupils almost gone. Its jaw seemed dislocated, but still moved, as if searching for its next victim. "Oh shit," Chris whispered and took a step back. What was once a human howled and lunged forward. Ranger Foz. The dog reacted instantly. One leap, and the animal had its teeth sunk into the creature's neck. But even that didn't stop the attacker. He staggered, began to grab the dog by the torso, but couldn't hold on and fell to the ground. Chris pulled his gun from its holster, a gift from his brothers after serving in Iraq. Without hesitation, he fired 2 shots, straight into the chest. The attacker did not fall. "You've got to be kidding me." A third shot, to the head. Only then did he fall silent. And he didn't move anymore. The ranger was breathing heavily, shaking the blood from his muzzle. The dog was not injured, but it was clear that he was frightened, for the first time in all his years of service. And Chris felt it. His whole body worked like it did on the battlefield: adrenaline, analysis, risk assessment. He returned home, locked the door, moved the furniture aside. He turned on the radio to pick up the police frequency. The airwaves were filled with screams, panic, and indistinct orders. "They won't stop." In the head, only a shot to the head. "We're losing control." Chris sat down on the floor. Ranger lay down next to him, resting his muzzle on his owner's knees. "Well, buddy," Chris said quietly. "It started. It's just you and me, as always." And then he realized his experience, his instincts, and this dog were all he had, and that would have to be enough. Chris sat by the radio for almost an hour, listening to the chaos in the background. Short, broken transmissions from police frequencies, sirens, distant explosions, and screams. His gaze kept returning to Ranger. The dog was lying quietly, but his ears were alert. Something in the air had changed. And not just the smells. Chris understood. He couldn't stay here long. The phone was silent. There was no network. The television was broadcasting an emergency message. Breaking news. National emergency. Stay safe. Damn. He leaned back, breathing in the musty air of his home. Then he remembered. There was a girl in town, Ellie, a former dog handler with whom they had trained together back in their police days. She lived 10 miles away, in a rural area, had her own plot of land, weapons, and, most importantly, a long-range radio station. "You may have dumped me, Ellie," Chris muttered, "but you always knew how to survive." He got up and began to prepare. Equipment, flashlight, ammunition, first aid kit, knives, water. The ranger got his bulletproof vest, designed specifically for K9 operations, lightweight but durable, with attachments for tools and a GPS tracker. His old Ford Bronco was parked in the garage, old but reliable, full tank. In the trunk, a supply of food, a shotgun, and another set of ammunition. The street was empty. The sun was already high in the sky, and the silence was no less disturbing than the screams. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled. Another dog. Ranger pricked up his ears and whimpered softly. "I know, buddy." Chris put his hand on his head. "I'm scared too." He got into the car, and Ranger jumped in beside him. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine started on the first try. "Let's go." To Ellie. Maybe she's still alive. As the car rolled through the empty streets, Chris armed himself with patience. He didn't know what awaited him around the next bend, but he knew one thing for sure. Time was no longer on their side. Gravel crunched under the wheels of the Ford Bronco as Chris sped between the fields, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. The roadside was already littered with abandoned cars. Some stood with their doors open, others with traces of accidents, blood, and scratches. "What the hell happened here last night?" he muttered. The ranger sat silently, but every few minutes he began to growl. He sensed a predator nearby, perhaps more than one. Suddenly, Chris slammed on the brakes. Ahead, right in the middle of the road, lay a body. A human? No, not a human anymore. The skin was like ash. The eyes were glassy. The corpse's chest was punctured, but it moved. "You're kidding." What was left of the man tried to get up and crawled. Quickly, with a wild screech, like a beast. Chris grabbed his shotgun and, without thinking, fired. A muffled shot, and the creature's head exploded into dust. Ranger began to bark, trying to break free from the car. But Chris held him back. "Stay? That's not all." Indeed, a few seconds later, there was a rustling sound behind the car. 3 more. They were walking slowly, but straight towards him. Chris didn't waste any ammunition. He jumped into the cab, pressed the gas pedal hard, and turned the steering wheel. The car drove around the obstacle, barely touching the creatures, and moved on. These things aren't just sick. They're dead. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in his head. Everything he had seen on TV. Everything he had heard on the radio. Reports of aggression, cannibalism, a virus that brings the dead back to life. But now he was seeing it with his own eyes. He pressed harder on the accelerator. Ellie's farm was not far away. But now the question was different. Would he make it in time, or was it too late? When Chris pulled up to the familiar wooden gate of the farm, his heart was pounding like a hunted animal. Ranger fidgeted nervously in the passenger seat, sniffing the air. They were home, but something was wrong. The gate was open, not just ajar, broken down. Chris grabbed the shotgun from behind the seat, checked the ammunition, and only then let Ranger out of the car. "Search, Ranger. Search for Ellie." The dog instantly jumped up and ran to the main house. Chris followed behind, weapon raised, covering the rear. The yard was too quiet. There were no birds. The cows weren't mooing. Only the wind could be heard in the distance. Ellie's old rifle lay on the porch, unloaded. Inside, there were signs of a struggle. The table was overturned. There was blood on the floor, but no bodies. "Ellie? It's Chris," he shouted, holding his weapon at an angle. Then there was a bark. Ranger returned, leading Ellie, who was limping, holding the rifle like a cane. "You came," she whispered, hugging him with one arm. "They were here. They came at night." "How many?" "At least 6. One of them was my neighbor. Only he's not himself anymore. They're all like animals." Chris clenched his teeth. We can't stay. We have to go. Is there anyone else? Ellie shook her head. Her eyes were clouded. My brother. He's in town. I don't know if he's alive. Chris helped her to the car. Behind the house, he found several cans of fuel, a couple of old flasks, and a supply of food. Ranger barked at the barn. They quickly checked it. There was a horse, frightened but unharmed. Chris couldn't take it, but he opened the door. Survive, buddy. He took one last look at the farm, the home that had given him a new life. And instead, he left it behind, like another fragment of the normal world sinking into darkness. Chris raced down the highway, holding the steering wheel with one hand and the radio with the other, hoping to catch some kind of signal. Ellie sat in the back, praying quietly, holding the rifle on her lap. Ranger looked out the window, his ears twitching periodically. Something was bothering the dog, something invisible to humans. Please, let him be alive, Ellie whispered. For the first time in many years, Chris felt responsible not only for himself. Now the lives of others were in his hands. I-70 looked like a graveyard. Wrecked cars, abandoned suitcases, torn road barriers. And worst of all, the body of a child strapped into a car seat, eyes empty, but showing no signs of infection. They didn't get away, Chris said, gripping the steering wheel. They were caught off guard. Smoke appeared on the horizon, black, thick. St. Louis was burning. We're approaching hell, he muttered, stopping the car at an abandoned gas station. We need to refuel. And check the map. They entered the building through a broken door. Inside, it was complete chaos. There were bloodstains on the floor, a broken coffee machine, and a cashier sitting dead in his chair with a bullet in his head. Chris took the cards from the gas tank and checked the back rooms. Clear. Quick. Fill up, he ordered Ellie, leaving her the gun. Ranger, come with me. The dog started growling again. It wasn't a normal bark. It was a warning. Instinct. Wolfish. Chris slowly walked out of the building, and at that moment saw a figure swaying on the highway. 1, 2, 3. 8 bodies walking straight towards the gas station. Zombies. Ellie, he shouted, get in the car. Now. He raised his shotgun and opened fire. Ranger stayed close, growling and lunging around, as if sensing every movement of the enemy. But the shots didn't stop one of the infected. He stubbornly kept coming even after 2 bullets to the chest. Only a shot to the head finally stopped him. Chris rushed to the car, grabbed Ellie by the elbow, took the gun, and they, along with Ranger, sped back onto the highway. They didn't look back. The roads were impassable. The city ahead was burning, and behind them was a fire at the gas station and a horde marching down the highway like a river of the dead. Chris turned into the depths of the forest, making his way along a dirt road. We need silence, shelter, and peace, he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Ranger jumped into the back seat and lay down, stretching out his front paws. Ellie was silent. Her face was covered in soot, wounded by anxiety, but without panic. She was holding on. When they reached the abandoned hunting lodge, Chris checked the perimeter. The windows were boarded up, the doors locked. Inside were old furniture, a fireplace, and canned food. We'll stop here. For an hour. Maybe 2. We need to think about a plan. Ellie finally broke down. She sat in the corner and began to cry. Chris didn't know how to comfort her, had no words. He just called Ranger, and the dog ran up to her and laid his head on her lap. Thank you, she whispered, stroking him. When Chris took out the map and began plotting a route to Leonard Wood military base, Ranger reacted again. He stood up, bared his teeth, and stood in front of the door. His fur stood on end. Something's coming, Chris muttered and grabbed his rifle. A minute later, there was a knock on the door. But it wasn't random. On the contrary, it was cautious, barely audible. Who's there? Chris shouted. Don't shoot. We're alive. We're looking for shelter. A woman's voice rang out. Chris held his rifle at the ready. He opened the door 2 inches and saw two people, an elderly woman with a boy of about 7. She was holding him in her arms and carrying a backpack with medicine on her back. Ranger didn't growl. He sniffed the air and finally sat down quietly by the door. "They're clean," Chris said. "Come in." Silence fell again in the house. Now there were 4 people there, and a dog who had seen more than any of them could imagine. The roads were impassable. The city ahead was burning, and behind them was a fire at a gas station and a horde marching down the highway like a river of the dead. Chris turned deeper into the forest, making his way along a dirt road. "We need silence, shelter, and peace," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Ranger jumped into the back seat and lay down, stretching out his front paws. Ellie was silent. Her face was covered in soot, wounded by anxiety, but without panic. She was holding on. When they reached the abandoned hunting cabin, Chris checked the perimeter. The windows were boarded up, the doors locked. Inside were old furniture, a fireplace, and canned food. "We'll stop here. For an hour. Maybe 2. We need to think about a plan." Ellie finally broke down. She sat in the corner and began to cry. Chris didn't know how to comfort her. He had no words. He just called Ranger, and the dog ran up to her and laid his head on her lap. "Thank you," she whispered, stroking him. When Chris took out the map and began plotting a route to Leonard Wood military base, Ranger reacted again. He stood up, bared his teeth, and stood in front of the door. His fur stood on end. "Something's coming," Chris muttered and grabbed his shotgun. A minute later, there was a knock at the door. But it wasn't a random knock. On the contrary, it was cautious, barely audible. "Who's there?" Chris shouted. "Don't shoot. We're alive. We're looking for shelter." A woman's voice rang out. Chris held the shotgun at the ready. He opened the door 2 inches and saw two people, an elderly woman with a boy of about 7. She was holding him in her arms and carrying a backpack with medicine on her back. Ranger didn't growl. He sniffed the air and finally sat down quietly by the door. "They're clean," Chris said. "Come in." Silence fell again in the house. Now there were 4 people there, and a dog who had seen more than any of them could imagine. The house was quiet. Even the boy wasn't crying. He was just holding on tight to the elderly woman. Ellie sat opposite, and Chris, as always, took up his position by the door, looking at the map and listening to every rustle in the forest. Ranger lay in the corner, but kept his ears alert. "What are your names?" Chris finally asked. "Grace. And this is my grandson, Mikey. We were at the pharmacy when it all started. The school bus driver let us in. But chaos broke out in the city. We fled into the forest when the bus overturned." Chris nodded silently. His gaze shifted from the boy to the door, from the map to Ranger. "Are you a soldier?" Grace asked, noticing his skills. "Former K-9 trainer, first in the army, then the police. Left the service after Afghanistan. Lived with Ranger. Until this morning, just a veteran. Now, I guess, a soldier again." Mikey stared at him with wide eyes. He finally whispered, "Is Ranger a real hero?" Chris looked at the dog. He was watching the boy calmly, attentively, like a guard waiting for orders. "You bet," Chris replied. "He saved more people than I have." The boy timidly approached, held out his hand, and Ranger touched it with his nose. Grace sighed with relief. Ellie, who had been silent the whole time, finally spoke. "We can't stay here. If we really want to survive, we have to go." "I know," said Chris. "We'll go through the forest to the old fire tower. There's a radio there. We'll try to contact the military. If not, we'll continue south to Leonard Wood Base. But," he looked at Grace and the boy, "if any of us gets hurt, infected, we can't risk everyone else. I'm not cruel, but I'm honest." Grace nodded. "That's fair. I'll do whatever it takes to keep Mikey alive." Ellie gripped the handle of her pistol. Her gaze became cold and determined. Now she looked like someone who was ready to kill for the safety of the group. "Then we'll leave in 20 minutes, said Chris. "Ranger, lead the way. No one stays behind." The sun began to set in the west, and with it came the slow, bloody steps of a new day. But it wasn't just a group of survivors walking through the forest. It was a coordinated pack. They had been walking for several hours. After a short rest at the hunting lodge, Chris led the group along the least passable paths, the ones he had trodden long before the apocalypse. His feet remembered every route, every slope. Ranger, walking ahead, became a true guide, sniffing the air, stopping from time to time, and growling into the void. "There's something up ahead," Chris muttered and waved to Ellie. "Cover the flank. I'll go check it out." Ellie nodded, raising her pistol. Ranger stayed with the group, while Chris slowly slipped forward between the bushes. The old fire tower was right in front of him, tall, rusty, like the skeleton of a forgotten giant. But at its foot were bodies. Soldiers, torn bulletproof vests, gnawed bones still steaming in the hot forest. One of them had no head. Another had lost both arms. Chris slowly approached, looking around. Silence. Too deep. "It's a trap," he whispered to himself. And at that moment, something cracked behind him. 3, infected, emerged from the thicket as if out of thin air. They didn't growl. They ran. Silently. Quickly. Chris fell on his back, raised his shotgun, and fired. One fell, the other only slowed down. The third one almost reached him, and then there was a short bark and a jump from behind. Ranger crashed into the attacker, biting his throat. Ellie ran up and blew the second one's head off with her shotgun. It all took less than 10 seconds. "We thought you had abandoned us," she said, catching her breath. "I thought so too," Chris muttered, stroking the dog's head. Ranger was wounded. There was a deep laceration on his front paw. "Are you sure it's not infected?" Ellie asked cautiously. Chris shook his head. "No, it's an old wound. It was already there when we fled the farm, but now it needs to be stitched up." 15 minutes later, they were at the top of the fire tower. Ellie stitched Ranger's paw under the lantern, Grace held the boy, and Chris turned on the radio. He had no hope, but the signal cut through the noise. "To all units. Evacuation points in Tulsa, Springfield, and Leonard Wood Base. The situation is critical. The infected areas are spreading." "We have contact," he said. "We're moving south. It's our only chance." But then, something new. Another voice. "If you can hear this, don't believe the official statements. It's not what they say. It's not just a virus. It's an experiment that got out of control." The channel suddenly cut off. Chris slowly pushed the microphone away. "What was that?" Ellie whispered. "The truth," Chris said. "Or a lie. But either way, we have to make it through the night alive." There were less than 10 hours until dawn, and there would be no light in this forest. Chris walked ahead, holding Ranger on a leash. The dog limped, but kept up. Ellie, Grace, and the boy followed behind them. They didn't turn on their flashlights so as not to attract attention. The darkness was full of sounds, the crackling of branches, distant howling, sometimes something like a scream, or a roar. "We're getting close to the road," Ellie whispered. "It's less than a kilometer to the old checkpoint." "There was a National Guard post there," said Chris. "If it's still holding, we can ask them for help. And if not, then we're our own army." Half an hour later, they reached the road. The asphalt was broken, and on the side of the road was an abandoned armored vehicle, partially burned. There were dozens of bodies around it. Almost all of them were military personnel. Only 2 of them showed no signs of infection. They lay with their heads shot off, wearing bulletproof vests on which someone had written in paint. "They're lying. It's not a disease." Chris looked at the inscription and clenched his fists. He knew. He felt that this was not just a virus. It was too organized, too fast. "We're not staying here tonight," he said. "We're moving on. Leonard Wood Base is our only chance." At 1:23 a.m., they saw the first searchlights. The evacuation point was set up at a military training ground. Concrete barriers, tents, equipment. Soldiers in protective suits inspected the arrivals. "Stop! Hands up!" someone shouted. Chris raised his hands. Ranger stood nearby, not barking, not moving. He just stared straight ahead. "We're not infected," Chris said. "And this dog is our salvation." After a check, a medical examination, and a brief interrogation, they were let in. Chaos reigned at the base. Groups of civilians were arriving. The wounded were being taken away, and helicopters were taking off every 15 minutes. "There's a plane waiting for you to Denver," said the sergeant. "But I have to warn you, it's going to get worse. We've lost contact with 5 cities in the last 3 hours. The strain is mutating." "It's not a strain," Chris muttered. "It's war. Not with a virus, with the truth." He sat down on a canvas bench, hugged Ranger, and stared at the sky. The first day was over, but it was only just beginning.